What's up guys, my name is Ace, and by the time you're seeing this video, Season 1 should be live for Black Ops 7. And today, I wanted to go through the patch notes. There wasn't any major weapon balancing, there was some attachment balancing, so we're basically just going to be reading through that instead of the usual side-by-side comparison. And there's one key thing in particular that has quite a few people up in arms in the community, and I wanted to share my 2 cents on that, and this is a playlist update where they're sort of restructuring how things are going to be displayed. And the key with this is they're now moving the standard mosh pit into the featured tab rather than its own separate tab. But we'll be talking about that toward the end of the video. Let's first blast through everything multiplayer-wise that we can expect as far as changes, fixes, things like that. And let's start it off with some key game mode adjustments. The first one is with Overload. They've added an overtime ability, and with this, for the first half, there's going to be an additional 30 seconds to overload or be killed if somebody is currently holding the EMP device on either team, and that's just going to allow for one potential scoring ability there. If that player gets killed, the round will end immediately, or if he scores, then the round will end right there. And then for the second half, the end of the match, it's the same story, but it only applies if it's somebody on the losing team holding the EMP, and only if they're losing by 1 point, so only if there's actually a chance for them to tie it up. And I think this is a solid improvement, especially for competitive play. It's going to lead to a lot more of those opportunities, and I think it'll make for some more intensity as well for those big potential comeback moments that otherwise wouldn't be happening. Now, in addition to this, and I think this is an excellent update here, if you're holding the EMP device in Overload, now you're going to be forced to switch to your pistol. And if you don't have a pistol on your loadout, it'll provide you with a default one. This one's great as well because it forces, or at least heavily encourages, more team play. So you want to be escorted by a teammate or a few teammates, instead of just lone wolfing it and picking up that EMP device and then mowing through an entire team. I think that does make sense for this mode as well. And so I'm quite happy to see those. They've also addressed some issues where players wouldn't be respawned during sudden death, or certain actions were just not being displayed properly in the score feed. Next, for the skirmish mode, they made a bunch of adjustments here. I'll be honest, I haven't touched this mode and I have no intention of touching it anytime soon, so I don't really know what they're even talking about with many of these things, so I don't really feel qualified to be talking through this and sharing my opinion on it, but all of these adjustments are displayed on screen here. If you guys are interested in skirmish, you can see those for yourself. It's the same reason I don't cover the zombies updates, because I don't play zombies, so I don't know what I'm talking about, so I just don't feel comfortable walking you through that information. Next, for maps, we're actually going to be seeing a couple adjustments to existing maps. On Exposure, they created a new path and interior to help players navigate from the loading spawn area, which connects to the solar panels and the salt storage container. Then on Toshin, a new hanging monorail has been added that connects the middle monorail section to the upper station section. And this is something I actually teased before launch. And I think this is an excellent adjustment to this map because as of right now, that one top lane through the train station, the interior area, that's basically just been used as a flank route. It's not really a common lane to be used for actual combat. And I think this is really going to open that lane up and spread players out a little bit more and provide just more options to get around the map. And I'm happy to see that. I think this is going to play great. Then after that, for your equipment, they address an issue where being stuck with a sticky grenade could result in low performance, and it's always nice to see them addressing performance issues. Speaking of which, I'm really hoping the console performance improves drastically with this update. For me, on my PS5, I've had no issues with this, but I do know this is a very widespread issue. I've been seeing tons and tons of comments and people tweeting at me and stuff, mentioning that they're experiencing tons of stuttering issues. I know it's a very common problem, so I'm hoping this improves. And if you guys have played after this update has gone live and you're on console and have been experiencing those issues, please let me know if things got better with this update, because if not, I plan on making a more dedicated video bringing something like that up. I've just been kind of waiting, anticipating that there will probably be some stability improvements with the Season 1 update. For score streaks, they significantly increased the rate of overclock progression for the Scalp Pulse score streak. I've seen a lot of people complaining about that it's just not leveling up to get your overclocks. They also address an issue where the skewer would sometimes not kill its target upon impact, and I've run into this a couple times as well. I've literally seen the skewer land on an enemy's head, and he just walks away totally unscathed. So it'll be nice to see a bit more consistency with that streak, and they also address an issue where the dog could display erratic movement. Then after that, they just made some UI adjustments. One of the key ones here that I noticed right away is in custom games, you couldn't add bots to a free-for-all match unless you added the bots while you had a different mode selected and then you switched over to free-for-all. So there was a workaround for it, but yeah, obviously you should be able to add bots while having the free-for-all mode active. Then after that, let's talk about some weapon adjustments. And like I said, there were no actual base weapon adjustments that applied to individual guns. They did mention they're planning to release a larger weapon balance pass a couple weeks after Season 1 launches. It was primarily just attachment changes, and another big change here as well is they reworked how they handle bullet penetration. And the way they described it here is previously, weapon penetration was driven entirely by the maximum distance that it could pass through a given surface type. And then the amount of damage you're dealing through that surface would decrease depending on the thickness. So the thicker the wall, or the more you increase the angle to that wall, that also increases the amount of distance that the round would be traveling through the wall. That would have an impact on how much damage reduction you're seeing while shooting through that surface. And it's one of the reasons I don't tend to do very detailed bullet penetration testing, because there are just so many variables at play that affect everything. Starting with Season 1, they're scrapping that system, and instead, they're slightly increasing the distance at which bullets are capable of penetrating surfaces. And if a bullet does successfully penetrate the surface, it's going to be a flat percentage reduction to your damage based on the surface type. So it no longer takes the thickness of that surface into account outside of can the bullet make it through this surface or not. If it does make it through, then you're going to be seeing a nice consistent amount of damage through that particular surface, regardless of the angle or thickness of that surface. And in addition to that, FMJ will now increase distance penetrated as well as reduce the penetration fall off. And I like the sounds of this. While it's technically a more simple system, and you could argue the previous system made more sense from a realism standpoint perhaps, at the end of the day, it just seemed like it led to a lot of really inconsistent situations where it really looks like you should be able to shoot through that surface and still deal a half decent amount of damage, and yet you wouldn't because the angle was maybe a bit too steep. I know this previous system also led to a lot of skill-based damage complaints where people would shoot somebody literally 20 times through a wall, and it's a fairly thin wall that you should be able to shoot through. But since it was at more of an extreme angle, you were seeing very, very little damage actually dealt to your target, meaning it could literally take you 20 shots to kill somebody, and the conspiracy types jumped all over that as evidence of skill-based damage when they just didn't understand how penetration works and how that angle really matters. So I like the fact that this is going to be a little easier to understand. It's just going to be a lot more simple, and shooting through surfaces is going to be more effective after this update. Now, with that out of the way, let's quickly go through the attachment adjustments. I'm not going to read through every single one. That would take forever, and I mean, you guys can read for yourselves. Plus, most of these are fairly minor adjustments that you probably won't even notice all that much, so it's really not worth spending too much time focusing on every little detail here. But with the M15, we saw a slight nerf to the fusion barrel. With the AK-27, we saw a bunch of very minor nerfs to attachments, primarily attachments that have an impact on movement speed. With the MXR, we saw some adjustments to some of the movement speed attachments. Some of them are buffs, one of them is a nerf. We saw primarily nerfs to movement speed attachments on the X9 Maverick. With the DS-20 Mirage, they also targeted some movement speed attachments here. Again, some of these are buffs, some of them are nerfs. All of them are very minor adjustments though. And there were a couple little buffs to some movement speed attachments on the Peacekeeper. Then for SMGs, on the Raiden, we got some buffs to its damage range barrels, and also buffs to movement speed attachments, at least various movement speed attachments. For the RK9, we saw primarily buffs to movement speed attachments, and then also several of the magazine attachments just had a couple extra rounds added to them, so technically a slight buff, and this is just to make it so that it's divisible by 3, because this is a 3-round burst gun, and therefore you get those nice, clean 3-round bursts all the way through your magazine. Then for the Razor, we saw some buffs, some nerfs to our movement speed attachments. The Dravik saw a couple nerfs to its damage range barrels, so they're going to be slightly less effective when it comes to damage range, and also a handful of movement speed nerfs on various attachments. For the Carbon 57, our damage range barrels got slightly buffed, so they're a little bit more effective. And then there were some adjustments, again, some buffs, some nerfs to some movement speed attachments here. And finally for SMGs, with the MPC-25, we saw some slight nerfs to our bullet velocity barrels, so they're going to be slightly less effective, and then some adjustments to movement speed attachments. And then finally for the LMG category, with the Mark 78, the damage range barrels were both buffed, and then we saw some movement speed attachments nerfed on that. Whereas with the XM325, we saw some slight nerfs to our damage range barrels, and then some adjustments to movement speed attachments. And there we go, that's gonna wrap it up for most of the changes here. However, there's the one big topic, like I said, that I wanted to share my 2 cents on, and this has to do with how they're reorganizing playlists for Season 1. And with this, instead of having the 2 tabs where you have your open playlists and then the other tab is for your standard playlist, which is just literally one mosh pit, now what they're going to be doing is that second tab is going to be for party game modes, and they're shifting the standard mosh pit into the featured playlist on the main playlist tab now. It's no longer the open tab, it's just the featured tab where all of the featured modes will go. And they did clarify that the standard mosh pit will still be the only mode that is using the closed matchmaking system, the one that we've been experiencing since Modern Warfare 2019, and all other modes will still be using the open matchmaking. So all of our quick play modes and every other featured mode that'll be in the game, that will use open matchmaking. It's still just the standard mosh pit that has the closed matchmaking. They also mentioned here they have been seeing increased engagement with the standard mosh pit over time. And all of this together has a lot of people in the community up in arms right now. The reception of this was generally not too great. And when it comes to my thoughts on this situation, I mean, when we look back, when they announced that Standard would have its own separate tab, even though there was just that one mosh pit, I thought that was a really weird decision to create an entirely separate tab for one game mode. And I was actually a bit worried about that because to me, that signaled that they were planning on expanding the Standard modes over time. Because why else would you create an entirely new tab just for one single playlist option that could easily just be thrown in the featured playlist tab? So what they're doing here is just bringing it over to the featured playlist tab, which is how I initially pictured things looking to begin with. However, now that we've actually got the update and I've seen this, I do have one big issue here, and that is the fact that the standard mosh pit is at the top of the list. So it is your default option now when you boot up the game. That I have an issue with. I don't like that at all. That makes it feel like they're really trying to actively funnel people into that playlist. And this goes along with something I haven't liked from the beginning, and that is the fact that they've named the closed matchmaking the standard matchmaking, or the standard playlist. Because if they were to call it open and closed, and you were to ask anybody that's playing the game, which matchmaking style would you consider to be the standard matchmaking style for this game? Pretty sure everybody would answer the open modes, because that matchmaking system is used for literally every single mode aside from the one exception, which is the quote-unquote standard mosh pit. So functionally speaking, at least, the open matchmaking is the standard matchmaking in the game. However, they've named the closed playlist standard, and I do feel that is likely skewing results, or likely going to skew results and cause a lot of people to go over to standard that otherwise wouldn't, because why wouldn't they want to play the standard modes? And that's especially true now that this is the main option that you land on when you first boot into multiplayer, because it's at the top of the featured tab. It might be the only playlist, but it's the playlist that it appears they're really trying to funnel people into. So really, initially when I was recording this video, it was before the update had gone live. I didn't have an issue with them scrapping the standard tab and bringing it over to the featured playlists. But the fact that they still call it standard, I don't like that. And I really don't like the fact that it's at the top of the featured list. And it really seems like they're actively trying to funnel people into that and away from the open matchmaking, which I do quite strongly fear is going to lead to more and more people funneling into standard, therefore funneling out of the open playlists, aside from the people that are actively seeking the open playlists, which tend to be the higher skilled players that were affected most negatively by the strict SBMM system of recent years. And I think that cycle is just going to keep feeding into itself, where more and more average to below average players, or just highly casual players that don't read into the modes, they're going to end up going more in the direction of the standard playlists, leaving the open playlists just fully populated with higher skilled players looking to experience more varied matchmaking that they're not going to see anymore because it's just going to be populated with other high skilled players. And this just essentially defeats the purpose of having open playlists. And therefore, the way I see this likely playing out long term is more and more people are going to funnel into standard, fewer people are going to be playing open, therefore their metrics are going to suggest that they need to expand the standard playlists and shrink the open playlists to the point where standard takes over and is the actual standard matchmaking again, while open totally dies off. And if that were to happen totally naturally, where it didn't feel like they had a thumb on the scale by calling the closed playlist the standard playlist, and now by shifting it to the top of the list in the featured tab, if they weren't doing that kind of stuff and this naturally happened, then fair enough. If players are naturally going that direction, and that's what the metrics are suggesting without any interference there, I wouldn't blame them at all for moving in that direction, because I would do the exact same thing in their shoes. I would support what's most popular and pull support from things that are less popular. For me, the issue here comes with the fact that it does feel like they've got their thumb on the scale there, and they are actively trying to push people into the quote-unquote standard modes until those standard modes actually become functionally the standard modes in the game. Either way, time's gonna have to tell to see how this plays out, but that is the direction that I'm sort of seeing things go. And that does have me a little bit nervous, since I definitely prefer the open matchmaking much more than the closed or quote-unquote standard. And we'll just have to wait to see how this shapes up and what happens with it. But of course, with that, I do want to hear from you guys in those comments down below. First up, how are you guys feeling about the changes that are taking place with the Season 1 updates? And second, probably what most of you guys want to comment on, how are you feeling about this playlist shift? How they're going to be shifting that standard mosh pit just into the featured tab and getting rid of the standard tab entirely and making that the party tab. And for those that have played both open playlists and the standard mosh pit, which experience has been better for you overall? Just let me know down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated. And don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.